record. There we go. That will make my colleague Rayanne very happy when I actually record sessions. So welcome this afternoon to, I think, the first breakout session for today. I am thrilled to have Andrew and Rebecca with me. Just to highlight a little bit of Andrew's background. Andrew, he's worked in community engagement, both in his current role and previously as a volunteer with the Parkdale Neighbourhood Land Trust. From 2019 to 2021, he worked as an educator with Counterpoint, a counseling and educational cooperative that works to end intimate partner violence through the partner assault response program targeted at men. He lives in Toronto and is a registered psychotherapist. So welcome, Andrew. We're happy to have you with us this afternoon. And next, our speaker, Rebecca. Rebecca is a cis white queer settler from Montreal. Her approach to community work is informed by her years of community organizing as well as activism, as well as her training in theatrical collective creation. She started at the 519 as a student in 2018 and has worked with many of the organization's teams since then. So I'm happy to pass it over to both Andrew and Rebecca to share their expertise this afternoon. So over to you.
All right, happy to be here. I'm just going to share my screen, so just give me 1 second. All right, folks, just bear with me for a second.
Down at the bottom, Andrew. Or there.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, so here we go. Our presentation is going to be talking a lot about Pacewood, which is a small emergency shelter in downtown Toronto, but it's also really going to be about expanding definitions of gender-based violence. So that's why I'm here today, and based on the intro that was already given, I'm really excited to talk about this from my earlier work on intimate partner violence in partner assault response, working with men who've been convicted of intimate partner violence. This is really close to my heart, so really excited to be here. Rebecca, did you want to say anything more about this point?
Let's just jump in.
Okay, all right. So in terms of the agenda, we're going to start just by talking about definitions of gender-based violence and the need to expand those and why it's important. Secondly, both Rebecca and I are going to be talking about how gender-based violence shows up in the work of our two agencies and the complications of that maybe. Then we're going to talk about Pacewood, this emergency shelter that opened up really just last year. We just celebrated the first anniversary, which is very exciting. And then conclude by just some main points that we want you to take away, and hopefully make a lot of time for Q&A and any questions that folks might have. Just to start off, and Rebecca, as always, just jump in whenever. Talking about gender-based violence, there's a lot of information on here that I'm not going to go over. I just want to make a few points to say that first, in a lot of my work, coming from a partner assault response background, there's a long lineage of talking about gender-based violence as patriarchal violence against women. The Canadian Women's Foundation has some really good stats just showing how intimate partner violence is so often gendered. It is so often about how patriarchy structures, excuses, minimizes, denies, and blame others for men's violence against women. But so that's one really important tradition of understanding gender-based violence. And at the same time, more recently, but also there's been long critiques about how we need to make gender-based violence inclusive of anti-queer violence. So transphobia, homophobia, biphobia, these are all also forms of gender-based violence. And there was a very important and really good research presentation from 2022 where the Canadian Women's Foundation also just talked about some of those special compounding forms of gender-based violence that are faced by the queer community, which I'm not going to read out, but I want to just say that there are these two main strands of gender-based violence and how we can understand what that is. Rebecca, anything before I move on?
Yeah, I think I'll talk a bit about that expansion on in just a slide or two, or this slide. So for those of you who may not know, the 519 is a community center in downtown Toronto. We're at Church and Wellesley. And essentially, we are a space that supports people in a sort of a well-rounded fashion, specifically at the intersection of their sexuality and gender identity. And so we have programs for older folks, for youth and families. We have programs for newcomers, specifically for trans folks, for folks who are experiencing food insecurity and who need support in access to justice, with legal supports and things of that nature. And so it's a huge endeavor, frankly, that we are looking to undertake. We've been around for almost 50 years. And in that time, lots has changed in the landscape of queer and trans inclusion, two-spirit queer and trans inclusion. And unfortunately, of course, violence has occurred in our communities throughout that time as well, and before, and will continue. And so I think one of the key elements that shows up in our work in regards to gender-based violence is that word gender. And so Andrew really spoke to it on the previous slide, but historically, when we talk about gender-based violence, it has meant violence of men against women, and specifically in that context, we're thinking of cis men and cis women, and that's where a lot of the resources go, and that's where a lot of programs have been, developed and created. And to be very clear, that is absolutely important and should continue. There's no part of this presentation or in either of our lines of thought that we think that this should not continue. What we do want to sort of advocate for and think about is expanding that, because it is not just cis women who experience violence at the hands of cis men. There's all sorts of different couplings that can happen that create violence, that lead to violence. And there's different ways that violence shows up in regards to gender. We can talk about intimate partner violence, as it says on this as well, familial estrangement, and familial violence based on gender is also a form of these conversations that needs to be brought up. And the types of violence that different people experience. How many times can I say violence in one 5-minute talk? But the types of experiences that people have in these situations can and is very different based on their identity, based on how they're being perceived in the world by their partner, by the world at large, and the sort of long-term impacts can also be different. They have obviously a lot of crossover, but people who are not experiencing support because they do not fit the mold of a person experiencing gender-based violence means that they will not have perhaps the same outcomes from that support or what should be support. And so at the 519, when we think about gender-based violence, we are including homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, and homophobia and biphobia. We're specifically thinking about the ways in which people's perception of gay, lesbian, queer, across the spectrum, people, their perceptions of folks based on appearance, based on, the ways that folks show up in the world. So it's not even because someone is, say, gay, that they will experience or sorry, it's not because someone experiences homophobia that they may be gay. People can experience homophobia and biphobia, even if they're straight, because of the expectation of the way that a gay person will show up in the world, the femininity associated with being a cis man and being gay, these like sort of expectations around gender that show up in our conversations around sexuality, bullying that we see happen to young kids because of other people's expectations of who they will be, of who they will want to be with. So that's where gender shows up in these conversations around sexuality, the expectations of gender roles, of the space that someone will take up. And then, of course, when we're talking about transphobia, that is very specifically about somebody's gender identity. And that has a whole, spectrum of realities for people. So that's sort of a bit of a riff on that concept. We could dig into the specificity there, but I do think that is going to be also individual. Somebody might be experiencing violence both in a transphobic lens and also because their partner is seeing them a certain way and interacting with them in a certain way, and it has nothing to do with their gender identity and everything to do with that relationship. Obviously, people across the board are in relationship with people causing violence. One of the things we see time and time again is a lack of support for queer and trans men and gender diverse folks who are experiencing intimate partner violence and things of that nature. As mentioned earlier, it's so important that there are supports for women leaving these kinds of situations, but there are also men who leave these situations. We had a client, I had a fellow staff member at the 519 reach out to our team to say, hey, one of our community members has had to leave his partner. What can you recommend? Where should we send him? And we had to go back to him and say, look, there's really not a lot out there. There aren't those immediate response shelter spaces that are specifically targeted towards men leaving violent situations at home. There aren't these sort of bursaries given to men who have experienced violence at the hand of their partner. And that's a real gap in these situations. Of course, straight cis men can also experience violence at the hands of their straight cis woman partner. We know that this happens, and as it was mentioned on the other slide, there's different ways that this kind of violence can show up. So that is necessary as well. But we do see this so frequently in queer partnerships and for trans folks and gender diverse folks. So this is something that we really need to be addressing in terms of funding. Where does, follow the money? Transphobia shows up a lot in who gets access to funds and who doesn't. And so part of the work that we do is around supporting folks who may not have supports elsewhere. We have peer groups that come together and talk about their experiences of trauma or, estrangement. We also, as I mentioned earlier, have a lot of newcomers coming through our doors, and they too have experienced violence based on their gender, right? People who are leaving countries where it is illegal to be trans, and not only illegal, but punishable by death. That is gender-based violence. And that is a terrifying situation to have to, come to. A lot of people don't come out in these countries, don't share that they're trans because, they don't have the resources to be able to leave. And so that those layers of trauma show up in the work that we do and in the stories that we hear from our clients or community members when, looking to access service in sort of mainstream, if you will, providers. So these are all sort of things that we see coming through our doors. The last point I want to speak to is the importance of representation of healthy queer and trans love. That, as you may have seen yourselves in the media, so often queer love stories, trans love stories are depictions of gender-based violence, of intimate partner abuse. It is people saying, no one will ever love you like I do, or you're, you're so beautiful to me, but, other people won't feel that way. And a lot of the ways that youth grow up to see themselves in the world is based in media, is based in depictions that they see of what is possible. And so we aim to, in our programs, talk about how to create healthy connections. We discuss, for example, in our newcomer program, we have a whole sort of adult sex ed element, talking about consent, talking about, how to flirt. If this is newer for you, some people have never had the opportunity to actually flirt with someone who they're attracted to for a multitude of reasons. And so we talk about what that can look like, what healthy touch looks like, what we can accept, and what boundaries we are allowed to put up. And I think that can be a huge step towards halting these kind of cycles of violence in our communities. So that's one way that we aim to do that.
Okay. So I'll just be talking now a bit about Homes First. So we're a large housing and shelter provider based in Toronto. I've been told recently we're up to now managing 20% of all shelter beds in the city. So it's a really large agency with a large imprint in Toronto. We specialize in housing those that are hardest to house, so very low barrier approaches to supportive housing and to shelters in general. And the way that gender-based violence shows up in our work is really in both senses of the gender-based violence definitions that I was laying out off the top. So these are stats again from the Canadian Women's Foundation, but there are huge amounts of women fleeing intimate partner violence who are coming to shelters and not able to actually get shelter beds. And so, of course, our agency is seeing the ways in which the issues with capacity, I mean, we're just so stretched thin in terms of shelter beds. There's, of course, a massive housing and homelessness crisis, which is putting severe strains on the shelter system, on our shelter programs. And so that's having an effect in terms of who can even access shelters, who's fleeing gender-based violence. So one of the sites, this photo is of our Kennedy Women's Shelter. It's for anyone who identifies as a woman for any reason, but large proportions of folks are leaving intimate partner violence. For this shelter program, it's adult women only. Typically, when women disclose that they are fleeing intimate partner violence, they would get case management support in terms of finding emotional support, special supports in terms of dealing with the special housing challenges. But of course, as I said, there's just very huge strains in terms of finding housing for our folks. So people are staying much longer in the shelter system than they would want. It's typically, in terms of when you think of a shelter supporting folks who are fleeing intimate partner violence or gender-based violence, it's a transitional moment. It's a chance to rest, to gather oneself, and to move on. But unfortunately, so many women and other folks, non-binary, trans folks, can't move on in terms of finding the next step, which is supportive housing. So that's one way in which we're seeing it manifest. But of course, we also, as a shelter, we're part of a system that has a much more deep systemic form of gender-based violence cooked into the system in the very ways in which first There's very good information about how 2SLGBTQ service users of shelters face higher rates of violence. That's a fact. But even more basically, the way that so many shelters are structured in terms of how they are gendered, how they are set up, can create a situation in which, for example, somebody who is trans or non-binary or just has a non-normative gender presentation, they might have to make a devil's bargain in terms of saying, okay, I need to access shelter. I can either put my own gender identity aside and maybe present in ways that feel uncomfortable to me and aren't who I see myself as, and kind of conceal myself and stay protected, or stay out of the shelter system altogether. You know, those kinds of really basic questions kind of show the ways in which gender-based violence can work on these systems. And of course, there's a lot of information also just in terms of intake, in terms of documentation, the ways in which all of those forms of gender-based oppressions are continually felt for 2SLGBTQIA shelter users, and the ways that people are misgendered, and the ways that gender assumptions are made, that folks' identity is not respected. So yeah, really, in terms of our shelter, we see a very expansive form of gender-based violence in terms of many different identities and folks who identify in many different ways experiencing often compounding forms of gender-based violence, even from the shelter system itself. Do you want to take this over, Rebecca?
Absolutely. So, how do we know what the problems are? As folks in this room may know, there are plenty of research studies that have been done around, you know, the needs of homeless individuals, of people accessing shelter services. And what ends up happening is that people feel really over-surveyed, that people feel like they are constantly telling, you know, the people in power what the problems are without any real results. And so this is something that we saw just recently if you go to the next slide to give you a little bit of context, in 2002, the 519 was a part of a consultation done with the city and a number of other organizations, essentially looking to understand what the needs of queer and trans people were in shelter spaces. You know, we were a part of the team leading this consultation, spoke to 30 trans individuals, had, you know, specific individual interviews, shelter sector staff, and, you know, spoke to a wide variety of shelters across the city. 17 shelters were represented. In that, you know, the outcomes from that consultation showed that trans people did not feel safe in the shelter system across the board. This wasn't relegated to one specific site or one specific provider, but more specifically around, you know, the system as a whole. And there were a number of requests that came out of that. Now, we did another consultation in 2022, where we again were asked by the city to speak to individuals, trans people accessing these services, community partners, you know, shelter service providers. And out of that consultation came the very same results. You could have put them right on top of each other and you would have found almost identical requests and recommendations. This, of course, is devastating and disgusting, and you know, the violence that people continue to experience is really horrifying. And so, fortunately, we have been given the resources to make change, finally. Coming out of the 2002 report, there was a request for a 2SLGBTQ specific shelter space. It took 20 years, but as Andrew mentioned earlier, last year we finally opened such a space, and we'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. Out of these consultations also came, specific requests about how that space should look and the ways in which queer and trans people should be treated in shelter shelter provision in general. The unique needs of these communities were being overlooked, and queer and trans people are overrepresented in homeless populations. There's 40% of homeless youth identify within the 2SLGBTQIA spectrum. That is too many. It's simply too many. So we see, sort of, by asking folks what the problems are, it's all well and good, but if we don't do anything about it, then what is even the point of asking? So now we've decided to do something about it. So let's talk a bit about what we did. So here, those are some of the recommendations you saw quickly. Just for example, that staff should reflect the residents, that the design of the space should reflect the needs of this, incredibly marginalized and excluded population, that there should be a safe space for trans women, a space to build community, all of these important sort of building blocks to the space. And these were seen in both the 2002 and 2022. Go ahead.
I'll start off and then Rebecca jump in terms of pace with just a little bit of history. This is a small emergency shelter located in Toronto's West End. It was, to give a bit of history, previously a shelter for women identifying clients and non-binary folks, until COVID-19, when there were new service restrictions introduced. That led the city to transfer the folks living at that earlier site to one of the new hotel programs for social distancing. And then basically a year later, there was a need to get those beds back into the shelter system. And so, working with the 519, Homes First pitched to the city a need for a 2SLGBTQ shelter, that this is how we should be setting up a new shelter program. And so the city approved it, SSHA approved it. The program is consisting basically of 2 floors of beds that mirror each other in an open dorm setting. There's a kitchen, a dining room, and a lower level common area on site. What's really unique and really important about this shelter is that the 519 actually acts as the referral agency. Typically, all of our shelter programs would typically go through central intake, which then finds beds and arranges for somebody to be transferred accordingly. But in this case, the 519 is the sole referrer, which we're going to talk about. It's a warm referral, and it really does a lot in terms of cutting down on a lot of the forms of, especially documentation problems and systemic oppression that's found at the intake level of shelters. And finally, the site is equipped with 24-hour frontline support, and there's case management and supervision during the days.
So I spoke a little bit to what the requests were, and here are some of the strengths of what we have achieved. This is the first of its kind, as it says here, in Toronto, to be intentionally structured around LGBTQ plus safety. I say that as opposed to 2SLGBTQ plus safety, because this is specifically a shelter for newcomers and not for people Indigenous to these lands. This is a pilot project, so we hope to expand, but this specifically is around newcomer needs. And this idea of warm transfers was created to avoid people having to, spill their guts in their new home. When folks arrive in a shelter, nobody chooses to be in a shelter space. It is not a space that folks have, gone into with, great excitement. And so to have to arrive and have the very first thing that you do upon arrival in this new space, which can often be very overwhelming and scary. Perhaps you're leaving something quite scary, especially in the context of today's presentation. We wanted to avoid people having to sit in what is to be their home for any length of time and share their trauma. Perhaps, worry about being misgendered, worry about have it being overheard, or, any of the things that one might think about. And so instead, as 519 staff, we do the intakes at the 519 or at other organizations to ensure that, any information that needs to be shared between our two organizations is done in a very thoughtful and sort of calm, emotionally safe way. And then that is given on paper, and folks don't need to rehash it when they get to Pacewood. This also means that people are able to sort of agree to community agreements and have pathways to restorative justice through our partnership. So 519 staff are going along the journey with residents. And it's not just, see you never. Carefully tailoring our supports, having follow-up supports for individuals once they've left. So we engage with them throughout with programming, and meeting their needs in partnership with the Pacewood staff and Homes First staff, but also ensuring that they feel like they are in community afterwards as well. I just see a quick question about the age of clients, and this is specifically an adults space. So there are a number of youth shelters specifically for 2SLGBTQ folks in the city of Toronto, and this is the first of its kind to be specifically dedicated to adults. So we do have people who are, in that youth range, perhaps of, mid to late 20s, but we also have a number of people who are in their 30s and 50s and people of a wide range of ages, because as we know, homelessness doesn't just disappear because you turn 35. So this is a really important specification of this space. Thank you for asking. I also know there's other questions in the Q&A, but that's just specific to what I was talking to right now. So yeah, I think, I've been talking, so you can definitely see those pieces.
So I was just told we're going to have to end a little bit earlier to get to Q&A. So I'm going to try and just rush a little bit. Stats and successes, I just wanted to highlight that when I checked in with our case management staff on the Homes First side, that since April 2022, 100% of residents have reported experiences of anti-queer discrimination. So just showing the endemic nature, right, of gender-based violence here and discrimination in general. And just to wrap up, the point, I think it is important just to emphasize that it really has to be both and, that the two strands of gender-based violence that I tried to outline both need addressing. There is a huge amount of women facing very traditional seeming forms of patriarchal violence from men. That is a fact. And there's also need to expand definitions of gender-based violence and make sure that other folks who are experiencing other compounding forms are also cared for and get supports. And there doesn't need to be a false choice between treating one or the other. In terms of, and that Pacewood is one solution in terms of expanding supports to this other larger population that gets underserved traditionally. Another point that we always affirm is that, as Homes First, we're a shelter agency. We're a large shelter agency with expertise in terms of running shelters. And it's been so important to have the 519 as a partner to do as much as we possibly can to reduce forms of gender-based violence that are systemic to the shelter system and that we are not experts in. We need that community partner to handle intakes and to advise us on how to serve clients better. That's actually deeply foundational to keeping LGBTQ newcomers safe in this space. Rebecca, do you want to add anything in terms of?
No, I think I see that we have some questions in the chat, but I think, yeah, we kind of hit all the topics we were looking to get to.
All right, I will stop my share.
Well, I want to say a big thank you, both Rebecca and Andrew, for sharing your expertise and your truly unique knowledge. We're getting some really great questions, so I want to start touching on these questions. I'm going to ask the senior specific, because through my lens, since we're Elder Abuse Ontario, I know through my training, whenever I do a general elder abuse training, I always focus on the fact that a Canadian report that was launched about 3 years ago highlighted, I think 21% of trans seniors are physically assaulted just simply for being trans. So a lot of the calls that we get to our office are obviously older adults, individuals that love these older adults, and we're seeing many individuals that live part of the 2SLGBTQ+ community that are now recloseting themselves as they're getting into their senior years. This one question really highlights where my mind is at around, are you looking at seeking opportunities to collaborate with more senior sectors or long-term care in addressing the reality, the sheer fact that so many of our older adults are recloseting themselves. They're highly socially isolated. We know that's a direct link to cases of elder abuse. Do you see a potential for intergenerational shelters with that sort of skilled support for activities of daily living? If either one of you or both of you want to take on this challenging question, go for it.
Yeah, I love this question because we're actually already doing it. The 519 is actually already in a decently long-term partnership. Not long-term in that it's been going on for a long time, but it is intended to continue for a long time with the long-term care sort of sector or what's it called, like department with the city and leading conversations with providers, as well as the sort of creation of protocols and suggested best practices. So beginning a couple of years ago, because it was still, I was on the team and that's been a number of years that I'm not there anymore, we were having conversations with the city around creating a toolkit. Then we had some focus groups with both people who were in long-term care talking about their experiences, largely negative experiences in those spaces, as well as providers looking to change the way that things are going. And so we actually have, I believe it's bi-weekly sessions. There are 2-hour sessions that we co-facilitate with one of the leaders from the city in that project, having conversations about and training about how to be better providers for 2SLGBTQ older adults who are experiencing exactly what you're talking about and meeting their unique needs. So it's, it's a huge sector. It's a huge problem, as you've named, but I'm very proud to say that we are doing that.
I would maybe just add on the homelessness sector front, across the board in all of our shelters, what we're really seeing is a aging of the homeless population and the compounding health effects as the homeless crisis not only stays at its intensity, it worsens. Folks are staying in the homeless shelter system for longer and longer, and that has deeply compounding health impacts regardless of your identity, regardless of the different types of violence that you're experiencing, we actually identify seniors as 50 plus because folks who are homeless, they are showing up with the health impacts of somebody who's maybe 15, 20 years older. And we're now, as an agency, trying to think about the need for specialized senior programs for folks who have been street involved going on 10 years sometimes and needing special supports that just aren't existing.
Really great point, Andrew. And I want to sit on the fact that as agencies, we need to be open-minded to lowering the scale for the senior being 65 plus. You know, really looking at that vulnerability level is so key. So right on for you guys looking at 50 plus. A lot of agencies cut people off, and I see individuals in that 50, 60 range that really could benefit from supports and services. And because of, you know, that black line, you have to be 65. You see a lot of seniors going without. So great that you were able to identify that. So we have two quick questions that we're going to get done in 60 seconds. So first question, putting the pressure on. So first question, what percentage of Housing First clients are homeless because they've had to leave a GBV situation?
I'll say from mine, and Rebecca, you can jump in. The problem with giving stats like that is that a lot of times folks are not disclosing the situations that they're coming out of. Maybe not at first, maybe not at all. So it's only if a client self-discloses that they're coming from a GBV background that they would be then supported specifically in that through that prism. So I asked my team for those specific stats, and unfortunately they were explaining that they can't collect them because they're not reliable at all. They're not actually showing the depth of how many people are coming for that specific reason.
And so hard for these individuals if you've chosen to live in these type of relationships for so long that it's hard to put words to what your lived experience is. Last question, we have 20 seconds. Were the MCCSS funded GBV shelters part of your consultations? And I guess this is towards Rebecca.
I wish I knew.
Okay, there you go.
But I did just want to say that that we also name older adults as 50 plus. And so if any of you are working with people who are 50 plus, who are 2SLGBTQIA, who are looking for community, we have programs Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday at our center. And it's a really great resource, and we do all sorts of different things. So if you are a service provider or you have people in your life who are in that demographic, send them on over.
Well, Rebecca, you made me happy that your criteria is 50 plus too. I've posted your websites in the chat, so everyone who's still online and not eating your lunch, check out their websites. Andrew, Rebecca, it's been truly a pleasure to have you with us this afternoon, and your contact information will be in your bios in the lobby, so please reach out, connect with these two experts. And thanks again, and everyone who attended, thank you so much for attending, and we'll see you at the next session. Take care, everyone. Thanks.